This is the BBC. For details of our complete range of programmes, go to bbcworldservice.com/podcasts.
Welcome to the latest global news compiled in the early hours of Saturday, the 22nd of October. I'm Oliver Conway with a selection of highlights from across the BBC World Service. Coming up, talks on a trade deal between Canada and the EU collapse after objections from the Belgian region of Wallonia.
It seems to me, to Canada, that the European Union is not capable at this point of having an international agreement, even with a country which has the same values as Europe as Canada does.
Also in the podcast, the UN says IS militants in Mosul may be preparing to use civilians as human shields. We hear from some of those who've escaped the group.
They
killed men from the army, she said. I saw IS kill a man. I was very scared.
The US Department of Homeland Security says it's investigating cyber attacks which have caused widespread internet disruption. And later,
women are the wave of the future, and sisterhood is stronger than anything.
Wonder Woman is made a UN ambassador for the empowerment of women and girls. But is she a good choice? More on that later. But first, it seems extraordinary that a region which is home to less than 0.7% of the EU's population could hold up a trade deal worth many billions of dollars a year. But that is exactly what Wallonia has done. The agreement between the EU and Canada, which has been 7 years in the making, was derailed by the regional parliament of Wallonia in Belgium. A visibly upset Canadian Trade Minister, Chrystia Freeland, spoke to reporters after walking out of negotiations in the Walloon capital, Namur.
Canada worked really hard, and I personally worked very hard. But it seems to me, to Canada, that the European Union is not capable at this point of having an international agreement, even with a country which has the same values as Europe as Canada does. Canada is disappointed. Me personally, I am very disappointed.
I asked our economics correspondent Andrew Walker why the Walloons were opposed to the deal.
They had particular concerns about the provisions in the agreement for allowing foreign investors to sue and actually seek compensation from host country governments over changes of policies that had an adverse effect on their business. They're also concerned about agriculture and exposing Belgian farmers to increased competition from Canadian imported produce. But there's also much wider concerns across the European Union among various campaign groups and indeed among parts of the population about fears that it might lead to lower environmental protection standards, lower consumer protection, and also would have an adverse effect on jobs in many different industries.
Now, the deal had been negotiated for many years. Is there a chance that it could still be resurrected?
Well, it's certainly true that the European Commission do not consider that the whole process is over. If you look at what the Canadian Trade Minister said, she was clearly some people are actually saying quite emotional, using languages like it seemed to be impossible to get a deal done. But I would think it's fair to say that there's likely to be a considerable amount of political arm twisting going on behind the scenes within Belgium and more widely across the European Union.
We also saw those problems with the big EU-America deal, the so-called TTIP discussions. Could this ironically help Britain with its Brexit negotiations? Because then it will be one country on its own negotiating.
It would certainly potentially be helpful in terms of Britain negotiating new trade agreements with countries outside the EU, like Canada, like the United States, if it doesn't have to worry about getting the consent of, for example, the Walloon Parliament. But I think it does indicate that in terms of making a trade agreement with the remainder of the European Union, it might be very difficult indeed, because that deal it is likely to need at least the consent of all the remaining 27 member states. And I think what's happened with Canada does indicate that there could well be some entirely unexpected difficulties in that area.
So basically each country has a veto.
The legal position is that trade agreements in the European Union are a matter for European Union rather than member state competence, and they are in theory supposed to be subject to qualified majority, what is called qualified majority approval. However, they can include provisions that go beyond what is narrowly defined as trade policy. So those so-called mixed agreements do need to be approved by all the EU member states. And I think there's a distinct possibility that whatever deal Britain wants might well run up against that hurdle.
Andrew Walker. The United Nations Human Rights Office says IS militants in the Iraqi city of Mosul may be trying to use civilians as human shields. It says the extremists have forced around 550 families to move from nearby villages into the city itself. The UN also said it was investigating reports that IS fighters had killed 40 civilians in one village alone. The BBC's Shaima Khalil has been speaking to some people who've escaped from IS-held territory.
The residents of Mosul are still trapped inside with no way out. But people who fled neighbouring villages and towns speak of harrowing journeys. This is a first glimpse into the horror they've endured to reach safety. Asad Hassan says he was frightened of what IS fighters might do as the Iraqi forces approached. He said the militants had booby-trapped homes in his village.
I left the day before the Mosul offensive began. It was a risk I had to take. The road out of my village was mined. There were 2 cars ahead of ours, and they were both blown up. I felt that I could be killed at any moment. I left with the women and the children. My sons left the next day. They had to swim across a river under heavy gunfire.
Debaga camp south of Erbil is one of the biggest in the area, but it is already overcrowded. Assad says he lives in the courtyard of the mosque in the camp because there aren't enough tents. 10-year-old Zaman came here 3 months ago with her mother and baby sister. She told me about her life under IS. They killed men from the army, she said. I saw IS kill a man. I was very scared. My father is with the army too. They threatened him. They said you either join us or go to prison, she told me. It's been 3 months now, and I haven't seen him. The United Nations Refugee Agency says that more than 64,000 people have moved to Debaga camp since April, with more coming in every day. They say there is a dire need for more space to absorb families as they flee the fighting.
Shaima Khalil. As the Iraqi army pushes towards Mosul, they've discovered defence tunnels dug by IS fighters. Our correspondent Ahmed Maher has been to see one of them.
These tunnels are very important and a key element in the military strategy of the jihadist group. It's very tight. I can't stand properly, at least in this part of the tunnel. Right, sandbags on the right-hand side here. And on the left-hand side, this is one of the exit points of the tunnel. And I have to say that this tunnel was cleared in by the Kurdish forces known as the Peshmerga. They told us it's 100% clear, but they advised us not to touch wires and some stuff. So if we see on the floor here, many wires used for electricity, for communication. Then we are moving on. On the right-hand side, here is a kitchen, or a mini kitchen. Empty glasses of tea, coffee, and on the right-hand side, copies of the Quran and some religious texts. Also, this is a telephone used by the militants to communicate to the outside world. So we're nearly there, and finally we reached the exit point of this tunnel.
Ahmed Maher, some 20 kilometres east of the Iraqi city of Mosul. Over the border in Syria, the UN has been forced to abandon plans to evacuate wounded civilians from Aleppo, saying it hadn't been given security guarantees. The UN had wanted to take advantage of a temporary truce declared on Thursday by Syrian and Russian forces, which has now been extended until Saturday evening. The spokesman for the UN Human Rights Commissioner, Rupert Colville, told the BBC the situation inside the city was dire.
Aleppo is just horrendous. People have been drawing analogies with Dresden, with Stalingrad. Absolutely smashed to pieces. Still many tens of thousands of civilians trapped inside eastern Aleppo, which has suffered the worst of the damage. And the conditions are just unbearable. And everyone can see that, everyone knows that, and yet there's very little we can do from outside.
More details from our defence and diplomatic correspondent, Jonathan Marcus.
The temporary pause in the Russian and Syrian air operations in and around Aleppo is holding, but it has not led to the hoped-for evacuation of injured civilians or the departure, as demanded by Moscow, of the al-Qaeda-linked fighters in the eastern part of the city. The Russian Foreign Minister, Sergei Lavrov, placed the blame firmly on the rebel fighters.
We are concerned about the fact that despite the goodwill gestures of Moscow and Damascus, with the aim of normalizing the situation in Aleppo, we see that al-Nusra fighters are refusing to leave the city. At the same time, they are also using threats, intimidation and brute force to prevent innocent civilians from leaving.
A special meeting of the UN Human Rights Council was convened today to discuss the plight of civilians in the city, where tens of thousands of people remain trapped in the shattered ruins. Foreign Office Minister Tobias Ellwood described Russia's behaviour as shameful. Despite the condemnation, Russia seems intent on resuming its bombardment of eastern Aleppo. For the moment, diplomacy seems to be taking a back seat, and Moscow is intent on increasing its potential firepower.
Jonathan Marcus reporting there. The authorities in France have announced that a migrant camp in the port of Calais, which has caused strained relations with Britain, will be closed on Monday. The camp, known as the Jungle, is thought to house up to 10,000 people who want to reach the UK. From Calais, Simon Jones reports.
The timetable for the closure of the so-called Jungle has been made clear for the first time. From Monday, the migrants will have to present themselves at a giant hangar where they will be separated into groups for families, adults, unaccompanied children and vulnerable people. They will then be taken by bus to reception centres across the country where they will be given the chance to apply for asylum. Heavy machinery will be used to clear the camp from Tuesday. The authorities say they do not want to use force, but if there are migrants who refuse to leave, they may have to intervene.
Simon Jones. She's one of the best-known comic book heroines and an icon of female strength. Now, Wonder Woman is being appointed as a UN ambassador for the empowerment of women and girls. The decision, though, has drawn some criticism. Hundreds of UN staff have signed a petition saying the scantily dressed white superhero could trample on cultural, religious and geopolitical sensibilities. From New York, Nick Bryant reports.
Wonder Woman! Wonder Woman!
UN officials presumably thought they'd engineered a stunning coup to make Wonder Woman the UN's new ambassador for female empowerment.
Women are the wave of the future, and sisterhood is stronger than anything.
But the selection of a fictitious superhero has provoked the kind of acid shower of criticism that even her superhuman powers would struggle to fend off. Hundreds of UN staff have added their names to an online petition which complains that a large-breasted white woman of impossible proportions, scantily clad in a shimmery, thigh-bearing bodysuit, is not an appropriate figurehead. A new Wonder Woman film is about to be released, and some UN officials saw its star as a vehicle to reach younger audiences around the world. But little consideration appears to have been given to how the superhero's leather boots might trample on cultural, religious and geopolitical sensibilities. The controversy comes at a time when the UN is already facing criticism for appointing yet another man, Portugal's Antonio Guterres, to fill the post of Secretary-General. The wide expectation was that a woman, a real-life role model, would for the first time do the job, shattering the most resilient glass ceiling in world diplomacy.
Nick Bryant in New York. This is Global News, the best stories, interviews and on-the-spot reporting from the BBC World Service. If you miss any of the week's events, you can catch up with The World This Week, broadcast on Saturdays and Sundays, and also available to download from our website. Let's return now to events in Iraq, where government forces are continuing their offensive to recapture Mosul. Iraq's second city is, of course, the last major stronghold of IS fighters in the country. Our correspondent Hugh Sykes gave us an update on the battle from Erbil, about 60 kilometres to the east.
It is interesting, isn't it, and chilling how well organised and efficient and ruthless Islamic State soldiers seem to be. They're fighting hard and ruthlessly, without mercy. Suicide, car and truck bombs, mines, booby traps, snipers, and anybody they suspect of collaborating with their enemy, the coalition against them, are punished with torture and then execution. A senior Iraqi army commander spoke to me on the phone from his forward operating base after a day's fighting against ISIS insurgents. Daesh, as everybody else here calls them. Apologies for the inevitable occasional interference from the mobile phone signal.
Hello.
Good afternoon. Thank you very much for speaking to us. How are things going?
أوضاع جيد جدا. القرى اللي جنوب الموصل اللي عم تتحرر تحرير تام وآكل الجوع من قبل العوائل.
The situation is good. We're trying to free Mosul.
And how difficult is the fighting?
سهلة جدا لولا معرقلة الانتحاريين والعدوان.
He's saying it's very easy because there are only bombs and they're not fighting themselves.
So Daesh are hiding. Have they run away or are they hiding, waiting to try to attack you?
لا غير مباشر.
They're doing it indirectly.
بالسيارات الانتحارية والمفخخات.
The first thing that they do, they come with car bombs and they use snipers and they use underground mines. And he's saying if they know that we're strong and they lose, they back off. If not, they try to shoot us. But mostly it's indirectly.
What do you think of the way they're fighting?
Their strength is not that much. They're not very strong. And I have hope that Mosul will soon be freed.
Is there any evidence that ISIS are using gas to attack you?
He says we have gotten information that they are planning something like this, but we have not seen any gas attacks from them.
How do you know what's happening inside Mosul? Do you have good intelligence from inside Mosul?
We have people inside Mosul. I have cousins in Mosul. I have friends in Mosul. They give us information.
What's that sound? What's that noise?
يقولش airplanes. I cannot hear it well.
أقول هاي صار 17 20 سؤال أنت قلت لي سؤالين ثلاثة يعني حكي بس حلقي.
عفوا. He says you're asking too many questions.
I'm very sorry. Well, there's one more question. Is there good cooperation between you, the Iraqi army, and Peshmerga and the popular mobilization units?
Yes. تفاهم قوي وأصلا هذا التفاهم أدى إلى هذا النقطة.
We have very good cooperation with them, and this good cooperation with the Peshmerga and with the Hashd al-Sha'bi, and this good cooperation brought them to this point.
أنا ثلاثة إخواني كافيهم الدواعش، فيقول لي على هالمعلومات أنا هم عندي ثغرية الدواعش، مو ثأر الدولة، ثأر شخصهم.
He says 3 of my brothers were killed by the ISIS
when?
fighters.
داعش يعني أخذ أخويا من دخل الموصل وقبل ما يدخل الموصل.
His brothers were killed when ISIS first entered Mosul.
Something I didn't know before the interview began. That was a senior Iraqi army commander speaking to me on the telephone from his forward operating base about 50, 60 kilometres west of here in Erbil.
Hugh Sykes in northern Iraq. The Department of Homeland Security in the United States is investigating the cause of cyber attacks which have affected some of the best-known names on the internet. Dyn, which directs users to websites, says it has twice been bombarded with data in what's known as a distributed denial of service attack. Laura Bicker reports from Washington.
The internet traffic company Dyn has issued a warning that it could be facing yet another cyber attack after a breach early in the day shut down websites across the east coast of the US. Millions of people couldn't access prominent online companies including Amazon, Twitter and Spotify after what's known as a denial of service attack. It's not clear yet who's responsible, but the White House said US authorities are looking at whether it is a criminal act. The Department of Homeland Security and the FBI are both thought to be involved in the investigation.
Laura Bicker in Washington there. It's been tried before, both by invading German troops and the Russian government during the Second World War. But now President Putin is hoping he'll succeed where others have failed and finally build a bridge to his country's newest region, Crimea. The multi-billion-dollar project got underway 2 years ago after Russia seized control of Crimea from neighbouring Ukraine. It's scheduled to open in 2018, providing a land and rail link across the Black Sea from the town of Taman on the Russian mainland to the Crimean port of Kerch. The BBC's Oleg Boldarev reports.
On a good day, you can see Crimea from the Russian side of the Kerch Strait. But seeing is not enough. After annexing Crimea in 2014, Russia wants a physical link to its newest province. especially now that the land border between Crimea and Ukraine is all but shut. And so from the Russian shore on the Taman Peninsula, a giant causeway is snaking into the distance, punctuated by huge cranes and towering pylons. You say Black Sea, and most Russians automatically think of sun, summer holidays, but in fact it's very windy right now and very cold. This weather is a very useful reminder that the only bridge which ever stood in this place only lasted for a few months before being crushed by ice in 1945. Bridge designers say they are more prepared this time. Workers weld together giant pipes which will make one pylon. Thousands of those pylons are being hammered up to 90 meters into the silty bottom of the shallow sea, one by one, over 19 kilometers of the route. The price tag of this 5-year project is a staggering $3.5 billion. This means that this year's share is more than half of the annual road building budget for the entire country. But, as with anything involving Crimea, there isn't a public discussion on whether it's actually needed. Political will drives it forward. If not for President Putin, we wouldn't have this project, says a builder called Maxim, as he fixes metal rods for a roadbed. He and his colleagues are in no doubt that the bridge is needed. They say they are proud to be part of this massive operation. But the contract, all financed by the state, went to a company owned by President Putin's friend, a building mogul called Arkady Rotenberg. The businessman and his company, Stroygazmontaj, are under Western sanctions imposed after Crimea's annexation. But the firm's construction director, Sergei Ryzhenkin, insists this hasn't seriously hampered the project or made it more expensive.
I cannot say this seriously limits our company. Yes, it's inconvenient, and getting some spare parts from our machinery may be a bit more difficult, but in general, contractors from Russia have enough expertise and equipment to deliver on time.
A few kilometers north of the bridge route is a ferry crossing. Ships there move people, cars, and even trains. Considering the huge cost of the new bridge, does it all make any sense economically? Mikhail Blinkin, a respected transport economist, says Russian transport capacity is way below the size of its economy. Many other roads and bridges need to be built. But other projects, such as a long-awaited bridge in eastern Siberia, are now on hold. Mikhail Blinkin acknowledges that economic reasoning takes a back seat.
Would this project, so big and expensive, hold up to the usual economic assessment? Probably not. Otherwise it would have been built a long time ago. But I take a more philosophic view. Yes, there are political problems and money issues now, but in 2 generations everyone will forget about them, and we will simply have a good bridge.
And so, sunshine or bitter winds, the work goes on. The first cars are supposed to roll onto this bridge by the end of 2018. The company building it says it will last at least 100 years. With no solution over Crimea in sight, what will it be a century from now? A symbol of connecting people, or a reminder of President Putin's riskiest geopolitical move?
That report by Oleg Boldarev. 61 million children, that's equivalent to almost the entire population of Britain, have been left behind in rural parts of China by parents who've moved to find work. That's according to the latest Chinese government survey on internal migration. Our Asia-Pacific editor Celia Hatton told me more.
China has a very specific system where your government benefits like healthcare and education are tied to your birthplace. So if you want to go away for work, which is what many parents in rural China want to do because that's frankly the only way they can make money and support their families, they're forced to leave their children behind if they want their children to stay in school. If they try to bring their children to the cities with them, their children are simply unable to continue in school. So millions and millions of parents are forced to make this rather heartbreaking decision to leave their children behind in the countryside so that they can go to get some work.
Who looks after them, or do they end up fending for themselves?
Well, the results of this new migrant survey shows that about 35% of all children living in China's countryside are living without their parents. Now, that doesn't necessarily mean they're living completely alone. A lot of them live with grandparents or another close relative. So we think there's about 61 million left behind children, as they're called. About 2 million of them are completely alone. So they're living without any close relative.
So what sort of age are we talking?
Well, under the age of 18. So the survey isn't more specific than that. But we have a lot of examples in the Chinese media, examples that have made headlines in China of children as young as 5 living on their own.
That is quite extraordinary.
Yeah, it really is jaw-dropping when you start to look at the numbers and you realise the stories behind these families' decisions. It really is pretty shocking.
And the fact that there's been a survey, does that mean the government is hoping to do something about it?
Well, yes, the government has already started to try to make amends for this. There were some rather shocking stories that hit the Chinese headlines, particularly one in June of last year where 4 children between the ages of 13 and 5, 4 siblings, all committed suicide together in an apartment. So that really raised the issue. After that, the government said it was going to conduct a survey to try to figure out how many children were living alone. And it was a survey of the migrant population in general. The government's also announced some initiatives. Now, they've said that they're going to allow 100 million people to move their household registration, so to receive benefits in Chinese cities. Of course, this isn't going as planned. A lot of migrant workers and their families are complaining that the process to register in the cities is just too arduous. And frankly, city governments don't want to welcome any more people, so they're making it difficult. But the government is trying to recognise this problem.
And I was speaking to Celia Hatton. Indian films and TV programmes are hugely popular in Pakistan, but as a result of growing tensions between the two South Asian neighbours, Pakistan has imposed a complete ban on TV and radio content from over the border. The authorities have raided shops selling satellite equipment which can be used to watch the highly popular Indian soap operas and films. The BBC's Asif Faruqi in Islamabad has the details.
This is quite widespread because the government has announced a blanket ban on any Indian content that includes soap operas, music and Bollywood films to be shown on any TV channels, whether it is on cable, on satellite dishes, or on FM radio or the other radios. So it's a complete ban which was triggered by heightened military tensions between the two countries. And then as a first, India banned Pakistani actors who were working in Bollywood or Indian films. They were actually asked to leave the country. And as a tit-for-tat response from Pakistan, this has come up, which is enforced from today, that all Indian content is now officially banned in Pakistan.
And what's reaction to this in Pakistan? Are people missing the music?
We have been talking to people on streets. Most of them, first you should know that Indian content, whether it's films or music, it's very, very popular in Pakistan. Any household which has a television set do watch or listen to Indian movies or dramas or music. So people are a bit surprised as well because initially the government said that the ban would be partial. For about 6% of the Indian content would be allowed. Now they have put a complete ban. Pakistanis do want to listen to Indian content. They do want to watch Indian movies and music. So they are kind of upset with this latest government announcement.
That was Asif Faruqi speaking to Valerie Sanderson on The Newsroom. And that's all from us for now, but an updated version of the Global News podcast will be available to download later. I'm Oliver Conway. Until next time, goodbye.